Well, hey everybody, thank you for checking in once again and welcome to another episode. Well, now, if you were watching a couple of months ago or thereabouts, you'll know that I was recently given this incredible Rolleiflex MX EVS model from 1954, and in this video I'll tell you what happened when I dropped it onto solid concrete. This is a camera that makes you want to do photography, or I found that anyway. And so I went out and I used it. Now then, the first time I went out with it, there was a disaster. And when I say disaster, it really was a disaster. It came to me in this case, this lovely old Rolleiflex case here. But what I didn't notice, and I should have been more careful and explored this case more carefully, what I didn't notice is that this leather strap, which is now rather shorter than it once was rotted and frayed and could hardly hold anything. You could take the strap and just put a tiny bit of force on it and pull it, and it would break and snap in two. And I didn't know, I hadn't realised, I hadn't tested it, and it was my own fault. And that is a lesson to me, and if it can be a lesson to anyone else, then you know, so much the better. Do check your strap if you get an old camera case. So the strap broke and the camera fell about 4 or 5 feet onto solid concrete. It was in its case, but the case came open. The top of the case came open and the camera fell down onto the floor head first, and it landed on this rear corner here. This rear corner took most of the force, so it's gone like this down onto the ground, bang, like that, and that's taken all of the force of the impact, and it was an absolute disaster. I just couldn't believe it. I just couldn't believe what had happened. I should have photographed it, but I didn't have the heart at the time. I was so disappointed. I just didn't have the heart to do it at the time. So this corner was crushed. This metal, it's only thin sheet metal here, was bent. The corner here, there was a crack in the corner metal running from the bottom there to the top there. Inside, where you lift up the magnifier, there's a little hinge in there, and this side of the, or rather the impact side, this side of the hinge was bent by about, gosh, I don't know, about 10 degrees. So the screen was sort of out. And I just keep using the word disaster. It was an absolute disaster. I just could not believe it. And I couldn't imagine, I didn't imagine that I would find anybody who would know how to fix it or had spare parts. I thought about fixing it myself. I realised it was probably beyond me, and I really shouldn't go messing about with things I didn't know would make a bad situation even worse. But I eventually tracked down one of the few remaining factory specialists who had trained at the Rolleiflex factory, had actually trained in the factory, a factory trained man. A specialist, a very well-known specialist, Mr. Mickleborough, he repaired it for me, thank goodness. He had a spare top, the folding metal parts, and he put that on for me. He cleaned up the shutter, which he found was a little bit sticky, and he lubricated the focus mechanism also. So all was well. A bad situation, a terrible situation, was rectified, and I'm just so glad. I was just so pleased to get this camera back. I cannot tell you how pleased I was to get this camera back and how grateful I was to Brian that he was able to repair it and that he did it. Rather, he did a really nice job for me, and I found somebody who really knew what they were doing, so that was just fantastic. So many, many thanks for that. This camera has given me fresh wind, so to speak. It's given me a new breath in my photography. I don't know what it is about it. It's just a camera that makes you want to go out and use it. It's so beautiful to use. It's quite slow. It's rather bulky. You don't get many shots. You only get 12 shots to a roll, and developing and film is quite expensive. So I don't know, there's just something about this camera that makes you want to go out and use it. It's partly it's the new camera effect, and I haven't bought a new camera for some time. I haven't played with a new camera for some time, and I'd forgotten about the new camera effect. When I get a new camera or a new to me camera, I just want to go out and shoot and shoot and shoot. I want to test old lenses on it. I want to run film through it. I want to do whatever it can do, and I want to use it and use it and use it. And a new camera, the right new camera anyway. Now and again I've had new cameras that I just didn't like, and that had the opposite effect. But if you get the right new camera, gosh, my goodness, it doesn't half revitalise your photography. So I've been out and about using this. I've put 3 or 4, probably, I don't know, more, probably about 5 rolls of film through it, one of which I've developed. This machine displays simplicity of engineering, but very, very high quality engineering. And it also has functional simplicity as well. It's got everything it needs. Shutter speeds are variable, aperture is variable, it's got a good viewing screen. In fact, I'll show you the viewing screen if I can. Oh yeah, there we are. So we've got it focused to infinity, and you should be able, if I can orient it correctly, you should be able to see the sky there somewhere. This camera is a study in elegant simplicity from the age of machines, from the mechanical era, from the era when there was no digital technology. Everything was analog and depended on gears, springs, levers and similar mechanisms. Now you might ask, where is the information in this hardware? Where is the software to run it? Well, the software is mechanically encoded onto those gears and levers and cams, and it's powered by hand. You turn this lever, wind up the shutter, advance the film, set all the gears and levers in their proper orientation, and when you push the button, they do their thing. They all have their information encoded upon them, and they pass their function on. They pass a function on to the next piece in the chain, and it's a chain of mechanical events. And that's how the software, in modern language anyway, is encoded onto the hardware of the actual camera. They're the same thing. The hardware and the software are combined within those gears, levers and springs. And that occurred to me recently, and I thought that was quite an interesting point. This camera perfectly typifies and encapsulates the age of machines. Now, I will admit it took me a little time to get used to using this camera. It's a very different experience to 35mm, and as I said earlier, all of my experience in film photography up to this point was on 35mm cameras. Many of them, but none of them like this. This is a whole different experience. It looks different, it feels different, it's different to operate. So I did have to get used to that. Before I tried this camera, before I used this camera, I did try a Rolleicord that was very kindly lent to me by a viewer. But at that time, I found it rather difficult. I found the TLR experience rather difficult. That was a slightly tricky time for me. I had health issues at that time, and you know, it's a little difficult. So perhaps perhaps that was one of the reasons I found it tricky. But yeah, the Rolleicord I did find a bit tricky, and this one too I found difficult at first. I messed up the loading. I loaded the film wrong. The film, if you've used one of these, is supposed to be fed. I can't open it, I'm afraid, because it's got a film in it, but there are two rollers at the bottom here that the film has to go between, and of course I didn't read the manual, just threaded the film as it looked like it should go through, and I messed it up and it all got folded up inside the camera. So there were one or two false starts, but eventually I really got the hang of it, and this is a camera that you bond with. This is so simple, this camera is so simple, there's not really anything to think about very much when you're using it, apart from exposure, focus and composition. It's a very, very simple machine, and now that I've got a strap on it, I've got an old aftermarket Olympus strap from the 80s, I think it actually rather suits the camera. I wasn't sure whether to put this on, but I think it does suit the camera now, and I'm quite pleased that I've got that on. So it's a camera that really makes you feel good when you use it, I find. It has a lot of limitations. It has only 12 shots per roll on 120 film. The film is expensive. The image on the screen down there is reversed horizontally, so when you pan the camera left, the image moves right, and when you pan the camera right, the image moves left. So that takes a little bit of getting used to as well. But once you're used to it, gosh, this is a real photographer's camera, man, I'm telling you. It feels like when you use it and when you look down this screen, down this viewfinder at the screen there, it feels like you're directly in contact with the light, if that makes sense. The screen, the viewing screen, is like a breath of fresh air. It's big and clean and clear and lovely. It feels airy and open and bright. And importantly in this camera, there is nothing between you and the light. Nothing. There's nothing mediating like in a digital camera. Nothing coming between the light and the photographer taking the finished image. In a digital camera, the light goes through all sorts of sensors and computers and circuits and switches and eventually ends up on a screen that's scanned horizontally. Gosh, how many times a second? I don't know, at least 50 times a second. So there's all that electronics in between you and the light, but with this camera, there's nothing between you and the light. You're in direct contact with it, and that's what it feels like. It feels like, and I hope this doesn't sound too pretentious because it's not intended to be, it feels like pure photography, photography in its purest form. Photography with nothing between the photographer and the light. The light just passes through the box into your eye and onto the film. And it's an entirely different way of working. You wear this camera around, if you wear this camera around your neck, it hangs low at the hip. So you're literally shooting from the hip. So it's an entirely different way of working, and that camera position gives a very different aesthetic to images. If you're shooting from low down rather than with the camera to your face, it gives a very, very different aesthetic in the images. And if you look at some of the famous street photographs taken with a camera like this, with a Rolleiflex, work by Robert Doisneau or Vivian Maier, for example, they're mostly shot from a low angle. From the photographer's waist or thereabouts, and they have a different aesthetic. They look and feel different. So a whole different way of working, both practically, actually using the camera technically, and aesthetically in the look of the final images. Right, the images. I've made some images with this camera. I'm glad to say, unlike the last time I featured it, I've made some images with it, and I was astonished by the resolution of the negatives. The resolution from 120 negatives shot with a nice lens like this Zeiss Tessar that's on here, the resolution of those negatives is truly extraordinary. I just couldn't believe it when I saw them. They were very sharp, very, very clear. I used 100, no I didn't, I used 400 ISO film. But despite that, the resolution of these images on 400 ISO film was just astonishing, far higher than 35mm, than a 35mm negative image would be, because it's a much bigger area. It's, I forget the dimension, it's 6 centimeters by 6 centimeters square. So that's a lot of film, that's a lot of silver crystals on that film to catch the light and to create the image. Incredibly high resolution negatives. Unfortunately, that resolution didn't come through on my digital scans, and right, so the images I've got to show you are not very well scanned, and that's been a difficult point in the workflow. I used expired FP2, Ilford FP2, that's a C41 black and white film, and I developed it in ordinary black and white chemicals, and it developed nice enough. The images were nice enough on the negs. And for these first images to show you, and so that I could see the kind of thing that was coming through, I just did very quick scans, first with my iPhone and then on a scanner, just an ordinary home scanner, each single negative. So the scans are, I'm afraid to say, I'm sorry to say, and I do apologise for the quality of these scans, the scans are not very good quality, and this is something that I really need to resolve. It's a step that I really need to get over. I'm not quite sure how I'll do that. For copying 35, for scanning 35mm negatives, I've used an old slide scanner from the film days, a slide copier rather, from the film days, and that makes really good copies, digital copies of film images. So I could try and find a 120 slide copier perhaps for a 35mm camera, shoot them on my Sony A7. I could try and do that to scan. I could get hold of a PlusTech scanner if I can find one, or I could just let a lab do it in the ordinary way. But scanning is a difficult thing with these 120 negs at the moment, but I will find a way around it. I will find a way to produce nice big scans, even if it's just letting a lab do it. Film photography is not cheap anymore, so I'm trying to do this. I want to use this camera as much as I can, and I'm trying to do this as cheaply as I can to keep the costs low, because otherwise that cost's going to mount up and up and up very, very quickly. The price of film developing and just film stock as well these days. So I'm trying to find a low-cost way to shoot film with cheap black and white film, or maybe expired colour that I develop as black and white, and a nice cheap way of scanning, like a 120 slide copier or something of that sort. But I will find a way around that. I apologise for the quality of these images. They're not great, but just to give you a taste of what I've been doing with the camera. As for what I do with this camera, well, this one, I've fallen in love with it. This one, I'm not going to sell it. This is a keeper. I'm going to keep it and I'm going to use it. It's good for another 70 years. It's very simple. It's not going to wear out. It's going to outlast me probably by several factors. So I'm going to hold on to it. It's a very, very beautiful thing. It's revitalised my photography. It's given me a breath of fresh air and fresh wind, a second wind if you like. So I am going to keep it. I recommend trying a different camera, trying a new camera. If your photography is a little bit flagging, if you're trying to find ideas, if you're looking for inspiration, one way to do it, if you're ready to make the step, is to try a different camera, a new camera, a second-hand camera, or a new one. It doesn't have to be an expensive one. It can be a simple, cheap one. It can be a nice, complex, cheap one. There are plenty of those about, good film cameras or digital cameras for cheap prices. But I do recommend, I do recommend trying the new camera effect. It's revitalized my fascination for photography by adding a new dimension, the dimension of the twin lens reflex and shooting on 120 film. So I highly, highly recommend it. So, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, I guess that's about it from me for this week. I'm going out to shoot my lovely Rolleiflex again. We've finally, I'm looking out the window, finally seem to have got some halfway reasonable weather. The sun's shining and the birds are singing on this beautiful Sunday, so I'm going to go out and enjoy it. Many, many thanks for watching. I do appreciate it. If you've enjoyed this episode, do chuck us a sub, that would be appreciated. Many, many thanks to subscribers for all your support. I really appreciate that support. That is a sincere and heartfelt thanks for that. Many, many thanks to patrons for your support. Again, a sincere, heartfelt thanks for that. Many, many thanks for your support. Thank you to everybody who's tuned in, watched, given thanks, super thanks, or engaged with the channel in any way. I do appreciate it. But as for me, that's it for now. If you're not doing anything too bothersome, difficult, or irritating, next week at around this time, please do join me and check in for another spot of Zenography. Cheerio all.